next session we move on to is the report out of the moderators from session 2. So I'm going to invite Maimouna Saleh-Bala from Ahmadu Bello University to take over and chair this this little session. And I want to note that Ahmadu Bello was one of the very earliest sort of participants in the IGC network and has been a fantastic footprint for us in Africa and Nigeria, helping to connect us to many other schools across Africa. And earlier on this year, you may not know, but Carl ran a workshop with Maimouna that attracted people from numerous countries in Africa. And I think is another example of a major outreach to that much greater community. So Maimouna, thank you. Take it away.
Hello, thank you, Brian. I hope you can hear me well. It's just started thundering here and the rain is pouring. So I'm trying to make sure that I can be heard. So hello, everyone, and thank you to this session. Is it okay? Is everyone hearing me? Am I good? Brian?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear
Hello?
you. I can hear you perfectly.
Hello? Okay, good, thank you. Am I good?
We
Okay,
can hear you well.
Yeah, sorry, it just started raining, and when it rains here, it thunders. So the whole sound system just changed, and we had to quickly. Okay. So anyway, as I said again, I'm happy to be here, and I would like to introduce the panelists, those who presented, who were moderators the second session, Richard, Tom, Daniela, Landis, and Louis. Richard did say he wasn't going to be around. He's going to be unavoidable absent, but I hope Tom is some around. Tom, can you just say hello?
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Actually, Richard cannot be with us this evening, so I was asked to report on
oh,
the
okay,
yeah.
that's great. So Michelle is standing in for Richard. Daniela, still with us here?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Hi, Daniela, thank you. Landis?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Hello, thank you. And Louis?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much. So can we, Michelle, would you like to do the summary for Richard?
Okay. Yeah, in our session, we had 3 case studies, one from Taiwan, one from Italy, and one from Israel. The first one was alternative future for green spaces expat by planting, Shayu Lu from the National San Yat-sen University. Second case study was actually the one I presented, strategic planning in the Cagliari metro area. And the third one was alternative future for Talpiot, rethinking growth for 2040, presented by Mariana Sigal-Klein. And basically, actually, there were 3 very interesting case studies that we have a lot of question and intense discussion. And actually, time was not enough to complete the whole discussion. We have a first set of questions regarding specifically IGC 2021 issues. For example, in the Taiwan case study, it was asked to what extent the target were met in terms of amount of green. And in the Israeli case study was asked the question about the trade-off between housing numbers and the requirement from green spaces. So these were really technical IGC, I would say, issues. In general, we discussed a little bit about how easy it is or it is not to run geodesign studies fully online. And in general, the response was very positive. And in my case, I worked with Carl last year as the pandemic started in several workshops. And in my case study, in the case study I presented also, we involved 17 municipalities in a real planning case study, fully online. Due to the pandemic, of course, and it was very successful. We just have to reason a little bit about the organization. We decided not to have an intensive workshop, but just to split along 2 weeks in several sessions, and this resulted to be a very positive choice. Also, because it gave the chance to the participant to, let's say, to reason a little bit more. Then it could have happened in an intensive 1 day or 2 day workshop. And the other question basically were more general about the process, and in several of the case study there was an involvement of real stakeholders, so this attracted a little bit the attention of the participant, and we discussed about the relationship between different stakeholders in terms of original background, politicians versus practitioners, for example, or professional planners. And we discussed also, I think, very interesting issue, to what extent some policies and decisions may or may not have taken before the geodesign workshop, when the stakeholders, real stakeholders, are involved. And also, we discuss how the outcomes of the study are actually affecting the final decision in real world processes. And from my perspective, I can say that the response is very positive to all the concerned. What I think is very interesting is assessing how influential is the geodesign studies in terms of decision that could have made before. And in our case studies, the final decision maker was the metropolitan authority. So the municipality, who in a sense already grounded their design or own decision that were possibly already discussed before and already made, they did it at a different level. And so we observe in the design a kind of emergence of a small-scale design from large-scale design. So there was a kind of, I would say, complex design emerging from the micro to the macro. And in this sense, the design was very new. And I think what we tested and was the biggest success was the subsidiarity between the two levels of government. In this case, the municipality were not decision maker, were participant, were just one of the many stakeholders that were heard by the metropolitan authorities. And their main concern was just to be heard, because in the normal practice, this is not often the case. And now the final decision is to be made in the following weeks, but the result of the workshop for sure will be input for the final decision. So maybe not the monolithic final negotiated design, but all the content of the design will be one way or another emerging in the final decision. And working in a real process with real stakeholders, we couldn't, was not the case that we could ask to apply all the IGC requirement, especially the latest. But another successful result was that in the final design, we could very clearly identify system innovations that we didn't require to the participant. So in a way, that is to say that, of course, we can help to foster the innovation uptake in design, but in a way, communities are already thinking about it. So the workshop experience was just a kind of help to focus more. And collaboration in this experience was the biggest success, and the mutual learning between the different participants. So I hope there was also a final question that we didn't have actually time to discuss. It was about how policies become specialized, depending also about the scale. And again, I'm sorry if in reporting I'm a little bit biased, then I can also, I would like to invite also the other speaker from the session if they are here, just to integrate my report if needed. From my perspective, our case study was a small part in a bigger strategic planning process. And in the practice, in the Italian practice, strategic plans most of the time are very verbal, big documents with text mostly, and with no maps. And including the geodesign study in the workflow of the wider strategic planning process actually helped a lot to specialize the strategies that otherwise would have been just verbal mostly. So I think I'm done, and if the other speaker from the session maybe would like to integrate a little bit more. Probably not. Maimuna, please switch on your mic. Otherwise, I think for the session 2A, we are done. Thank you.
I'm sorry, it was thundering. Okay, can we have Tom do his own brief?
Sure, good.
And then we
Thank
can
you.
do the discussions after
Yeah.
we've all summarized.
Great. Thank you,
you.
Maimuna. Well, in our session, we had Tijana from the University of Belgrade present. We also had Maimuna present her work in Zaria, Nigeria. We also had Jose Marcelo Medeiros from University of Tocantins in Brazil present. If there was a overarching theme or set of themes, I think all three of them were addressing the issue of agroforestry, the idea of sort of creating a new kind of way to think about replanting and reforestation, as well as I think there was a theme that in all three cases, the presentations were running quite counter to what the government is planning on doing. And so there was a kind of a dissent quality to all three of the presentations. So the University of Belgrade project that Tijana presented was in the Ivanica region of Serbia, which is a depopulating region, a lot of fragmented land ownership. The government is proposing building a highway, putting in a large number of small hydro plants, building this big tourism center that might end up being a kind of brownfield with relatively little concern about the environment or even about community impacts. And so the University of Belgrade project really showed a more sustainable path than what the current planning process is, where it's going. Actually, in its early adopter proposal, it called for abandoning the current proposals entirely and moving toward a reforestation direction with more ecotourism, more agriculture. They talked about the rewilding of Europe effort that's underway. Also interesting ideas around digital tourism and digitally connecting urban and rural residents around agriculture, and had this idea of thinking of the region as a kind of nursery or garden of innovations. So really flipping the model that the government is anticipating. And so it was all really very interesting. Maimuna talked about how Nigeria is a signatory to the Paris Climate Commitment Accord and is in support of the Trillion Trees project. But the real question is where and what to plant. How does one go about reforestation in Nigeria? And so in their study area, they looked particularly at the planting of indigenous trees And one of the issues that came up in their study that we also talked about is how do you move subsistence farming, which is widespread in that area, to more agroforestry, to a more formal agricultural base, and really calling on the government to focus more on food security, green infrastructure, renewable energy strategies as well. So that was also a really fascinating reversal of where the government is currently going, and was also, I think, generated a lot of conversation. And then finally, the University of Tocantins looked at Palmas and the conflicts there between reforestation and vegetation versus urban sprawl. Jose Marcelo really talked about the fact that there's a lot of extended infrastructure in that new planned city, and for a relatively small population. And so their project really looked at innovations like solar and wind energy generation, reforestation, down to providing low albedo and permeable pavements. Again, the idea of agroforestry and agrotourism is all strategies to counter sprawl that is anticipated to occur there. Some of the issues that we talked about in the discussion phase, one of them had to do with land ownership. I think it was Brian who brought up this question of who owns the land, and how does one transform an economy to a kind of agroforestry when there are a lot of small landowners or landowners who may not be amenable to that. And so this idea of how do we incentivize people to convert their current use of land to reforestation, and how do we establish that in terms of an economic development strategy. And so that was also, we discussed a bit about the idea of how can we link tree planting to both economic development as well as to human health. And so, part of the conversation was around, how do we sell the planting of trees around other priorities that governments might have. We also had a conversation around this, as other groups have talked about, the way in which these are related to policies, and how we can influence decision makers, particularly in these three projects that are really running quite counter to what decision makers are planning on doing. Alan Shearer brought up the idea of, in the spatialization of policy, are we really doing this to understand existing policies, or are we using spatialization to really propose entirely new directions? So this idea of difference of degree and kind. And so this, again, this idea of how can geodesign be an agent of change in decision making. And then we also had a conversation at the end of our session around what can the world do, particularly around the Brazilian Amazon rainforest and the deforestation that's occurring there. And the recognition that this is really a global concern that extends way beyond Brazil. And what could the world do to sort of change that direction of that. Jose Marcelo brought up the point that a lot of that is being now turned into soybean production for largely for Asia and China. And so how might we think about new kinds of markets that would actually encourage the planting of trees rather than the removal of trees for soybean production. So in any event, I think we also were quite impressed, as I think we all are, by the coordinated effort of all of the Brazilian universities. And we did talk a bit about how that might be a model, as we've also talked here today, for other countries to work in a more coordinated way. So maybe with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Mamana.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. I think you've raised a lot of questions for discussions after the panelist briefs. Maybe we listen to Daniela, then we'll come back to see how we can address some of the questions you've raised during your brief. Okay, thank you. Daniela, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Maimuna, and thank you everyone for all the organizing. I know it's quite a challenge to pull all of us together from all across the globe. So it's really an impressive effort. We had 3 projects in our session. We had one from Sweden, where it was looking at a coastal town and trying to understand the challenges between addressing sea level rise, bringing in trees, as well as issues of population growth. Then we had another project also as part of the Brazilian effort where they were really focused on, again, the tree concerns, but then really focused on the process by which you get people to come along. And then we had a third project, which was a joint effort between Utah State University and Leibniz University, where the students worked jointly across 2 continents to think about what is resilience within Cache Valley. So these were the 3 different projects that we had. And we had, I'd say, 2 main themes that came out of our conversation. The first of the themes was a question of what should we be measuring? And should we be measuring carbon sequestration? Is that the thing that makes the most sense? Are we seeing in the data what we thought we would see? We found, particularly in the Brazilian example, some concerns that the trees, even despite all of the efforts, that the trees were not achieving the goals of carbon sequestration. Similarly, in the Sweden location, there was a recognition that perhaps the trees weren't actually the best thing to address sea level rise, or maybe it wasn't the right climate for that. And then in the Utah example, our students worked on thinking about resilience. And so we had a conversation about resilience and sustainability and the relationship between the 2. So that was one theme that came out as this question of what are we measuring in order to determine how successful these projects are. The other theme that really jumped out, and others who are in my session are welcome to chime in, but the other theme that really jumped out to me was this question of process and the extent to which the process of geodesign and the different ways the different projects implemented that process, how successful that was. So in the Sweden example, they did a really interesting thing where they actually, at the end of the negotiation, they conducted a survey to determine whether or not everybody would in fact vote for the negotiated design. And in theory, you'd say, okay, we all went through this negotiation and here's the negotiated design and we would all vote for it. And what they found was that 50% said yes, they'd vote for it, and 50% said no, they wouldn't vote for it. But if you removed the people who were in the final negotiation, the design would not actually pass. And so I think it was brought up a really interesting conversation around the negotiation process and the end result, and whether or not the end result would be something that would pass through. So I thought that was a really interesting process question that came up. Similarly, for Chico in Brazil, he really focused on doing the no measures approach first, as a way of saying, rather than focusing on what's innovative and what's new, maybe we need to bring people through not doing anything and help them understand what not doing anything looks like, and then go back and do different ways of doing an early adopter and a late adopter. So it was a really interesting process approach that team did. And then Barty and myself ran the last one, and it was really interesting to have a team in Germany and a team in the United States working on this project together. The German students never saw the site. It was all done virtually. And so that was a really interesting collaboration process of handing off work products and working through. So there was some really interesting process pieces. The other thing that we talked about a bit in our conversation and discussions was really just what are some future ideas or ways that we could take this work further. We had a conversation about revisiting projects and going back and saying, okay, we have X number of years of projects. Let's go back and say, are these matching up to original thinking? and then doing a lot of work on gathering the information on the innovations that were used to devise better ways to share those innovations. How can we compile that information and that data? And thinking about potentially building a route map approach so that places could say, let's say every 5 years, we can revisit the information, we can revisit the data, and we can branch off on different routes as we move forward. So I don't know if anyone else who was in my session had other memories, but those were the things, the issues about process, some of these future ideas, and the measurements were the big things in our discussion. And Maimuna, I will pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniela. Can we have Landis before we go to the general conversation and the discussions? So Landis, you have the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, so in our session, we had 3 presentations as well. One from Florida, a project called Assessing a Suitable Infrastructure Land System for the City of Apopka. We had 2 projects from Brazil, one in Campinas, Geodesign for Organization of Land Use in the Metropolitan Region of Campinas, and then trees for Sao Paulo Metropolitan Region. Some of the similarities between all these projects, some of the themes that ran through them was looking at population growth and urban sprawl and the effects that this has on creating limitations as to where you can implement and install green infrastructure, water infrastructure, other systems like that. It was a common project that all of these looked at. So then in the discussion, we started by talking about the likelihood that any of their solutions and proposals might be adopted within the time frame between now and 2035 and now or 2050. And there was some specific hopes that the presenters had where they do expect that some of their ideas and designs will get a chance to be heard and considered, and some might actually see some form of implementation. There is an understanding that that would be based on the specific designs themselves. And one source of this hope that was brought up is that they had examples of other cities in other regions doing similar solutions successfully. So they had case studies to argue their point and demonstrate effectiveness. Also, we talked a lot about the benefits of the Brazilian projects working together, as I'm sure most sessions did. But one thing that I thought was important to note from that discussion was the idea that having these universities working together allowed for them to share ideas, and this allowed the individual universities to create a roadmap using the examples and lessons learned from what worked and didn't work by the other universities in their system. And they were excited about that, and we were discussing how might we help, how would IGC promote this cross-networking between other universities to help each other learn from not just their own experiences, but from the experiences of others. One of the groups broke their team up into 3 different subgroups, one looking at the needs of the environment, one looking at needs of the economy, one looking at needs of the society. We had a brief discussion about how the specific value points influenced the project design and influenced the negotiations. And one takeaway from this that we talked about was that the students were able to get really passionate about their proposals and their ideas. And even though when the negotiations started, they were a little timid about standing their ground and sticking by their proposals. But as they went through the day and longer through the negotiations, and they were really able to embrace their proposals and really start to stand up for them, and yeah, argue for them well, which is exciting. That shows the value of this process. Also, with the Brazilian projects, we discussed. This was discussed this morning. But we had one of the groups was entirely made up of landscape architect students, and the one was all geographers. And so we talked about the interesting comparisons and contrasts between the groups and how they conducted their processes and the contributions they made to their studies that were specific to their values and backgrounds. And we had a exciting conceptualizing of what this would look like if we were to do this project again, but mix up those teams. So create a team of both landscape architects and geographers from these different regions working on the same project, bringing these backgrounds together. So that was just exciting to see what people were learning from this process and what it might look like in the years to come. And we also, I think probably again, as most sessions did, we discussed the impact COVID had on the past year on these projects, and a list of pros and cons. One of the cons being that many of the site visits were done virtually for the students, so they didn't get to actually go on location and get a sense of the place themselves. And there was a brief discussion about how that probably dictated some of the values and some of the things that were became the focus of the projects that might not otherwise have been the focus if they were able to do a proper site visit. But then there were also lots of pros that we discussed, such as just the ability to work with people in different states, in different countries in the world, and really do a much broader collaboration and bring in insights from all over. And another con, though, kind of with that, we talked about that the negotiations, since the negotiations were done virtually and given the limitations of having robust social interaction over virtual systems like Zoom, some people felt that the negotiations were hindered and were not as robust and impactful as they might otherwise have been if they could have been in person. But yeah, that's a brief highlight of all the many interesting points of conversation that we had. So I'll pass it back.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Landis. We did have a lot to discuss in the session, and it was quite, I'm sure we can go on and on and on. But can we have Louis now? And hopefully we'll have enough time for the question and answers. So Louis, the mic is over to you now.
Thank you so much. So in our session, we have two excellent projects. The first one is from Nismikon University of Japan. Speaker Hamid Lehman, he talked about the sustainable geodesign of Alexandria downtown in the framework of National Sustainable Development Strategy, Egypt version 2030. And the second project is from Texas A&M University, US. And Jihan Tao talks about the design for depopulation city regeneration in Johnstown. This is a project that develops a framework for design and planning for shrinking cities, integrating the permanent functions into potential high development areas and more temporary functions into decline areas. So those two projects have some similarities and also have a very big different features. Look at the spatial scales. So the project in Alexandria, it is really a regional scale project with 40 kilometer by 40 kilometer square boundaries, and the Johnstown project emphasize on the smaller scales of 400 meter by 400 meter square boundaries. So in our session, we really have had a wonderful and great discussion. Lots of shared questions have been discussed, and we clearly observed the distinct strategies from top-down and bottom-up decision-making process. But at the same time, challenges and opportunities exist in both. So the first shared questions we discussed is about how to address the potential values about the place in both projects, any challenges or pressures. So in Alexandria project, they utilize a top-down decision-making process with a lot of different stakeholders. Mainly they utilize like the strategies like protected zones to preserve the outstanding value of the study areas that related to regulation. So they recognize the pressures exist, development pressures on cultural heritage of the downtown areas has the highest commercial value in Alexandria's governance. So, and in our second project, Johnstown project, it is a totally different, it's like opposite angles to tackle with the local resources. So they made decisions mainly where to digging out and optimizing the potential values from bottom up thinking. For example, they utilize, their strategies to shift and reduce the empty place, vacant land, and adopt new opportunities such as the importing the IT industries entrepreneurship as a ways of creating new opportunities. So one specific questions that from Carol asked about who actually make the geodesign proposal in Alexander project. And we recognize they do have a lot of collaborators, including Lis Mekong University, governmental agencies, research institutes, and etc. This is a very diverse, decision-making process by different stakeholders. And personally, from my perspective, I witnessed the Alexandra project. It is the one project that didn't fully, incorporate the IGC format. I'm wondering, but we haven't discussed. Is there any challenges or pressures to adopt over IGC format, and why they cannot, fully turn into such a great professional project in IGC format? So in the end, a very interesting discussion from Alan. He mentions like the geodesign framework, and we always emphasize we need to provide and promote more sustainability in any projects. However, situations in our second small scale project of like a depopulation trend. So the reality is like less people desire to live in a place, and we will have a plenty of space to be utilized as a way of protecting our environment and creating new habitat areas, and how we truly adapt the geodesign framework in a very efficient ways in such a apparent feature of shrinking cities, and how to integrate the six model at the same time facing that less desirable situations. So I think we didn't have a 100% confidence like the perfect answers for the questions, and the second team, they do recognize challenges to exist, and they recognize maybe the long-term sustainability, it is a goals for geodesign framework, and it is even hard to apply and evaluate in shrinking cities. So on their infrastructure planning for such situations, it is really hard to make a decision on whether to make a totally brand new plan, or by clear up the place, or other ways to adapt the environment. I think in their project, they preferred more on promote new opportunities based on their potential values, and such as like the new opportunities from industry development, the entrepreneurship, the IT industries, but they also at the same time they wish to reuse and recreate the sense of the local place based on their local conditions. So for their mapping stuff, it is hard to see like the hidden contents of how they change, how the changing model occurs, such as they mark the purple area of the, like it is industrial areas, but it is hard to read at the first glance to see what exactly the change by such a land. Actually, they do offer a lot of detailed strategies to reuse the potential values to make the new and updated version of the industrial land. So this is something about our session. I think for me, it is a very good opportunity to rethink how the IGC will continue and incorporate like the professional project, like the big scale project from Egypt, and and also like Brian Allen has mentioned before, so which is a better way, to let and incorporate more people to come in and to adapt the IGC format. So this is also a good opportunity to think about. So I think I'm down for my sessions. If I miss something, please jump out and we can discuss a little bit.
Thank you very much, Louis. Very, very comprehensive briefings. You've discussed all the panels, panelists have discussed most of the questions that were raised and have answered them, but we do have many, and I don't know if time will permit us to look at all. But I'll just take some of the comments and questions from the chat, and then we'll be like interchanging with what we also will want to discuss amongst the questions that we've raised amongst ourselves. There's one from Brian to everyone. He says, well, to Michelle, I was in your session. An important element of those studies was that each was a real study and formal inputs to public and government groups. Do you think that the next study will be more influential and embraced by the public authorities? Michelle, over to you. Only that our answers will have to be very brief because we are really like, we don't have time on our side. We have like about just 10 minutes to round up. So it has to be very—
I believe my answer is yes, definitely. Because as you run a project with a real stakeholder within an institutional process, basically, and when people are satisfied, and in my experience, participants are always satisfied, very satisfied. And in the latest case study, it was many participants, both in a survey and an informal comment, specified that it was the first time for them that they could collaborate all together. Sometimes there is intermunicipal collaboration within a single project, but they never reason about and discuss about regarding an higher level of planning than the local one. So they were happy, and I think the word will spread among other municipalities. Of course, authorities are interconnected in networks. So I believe, and of course, also for us to being able to say, we did this experience and it was successful and document them, I think is a good opportunity and people are attracted. And if everybody that participates is happy, sooner or later, other people will want to join. Regarding the limitation in my study in adopting the full IGC framework, I think I will continue to work on the result of my study, this time within the university with students, with a master student, maybe with PhD, and I will do further research, and I plan to publish the result. So this way I will be able also to show what could be the extra advantage, not only of using Geodesign, but also of adopting the IGC specific approach.
Okay, thank you. There's another one for Tom. Hello, yeah, for Tom. There's a question, there's a statement here and a question that the project seems to have a meeting point of two primary needs, food versus trees. Were there any common lessons about how to balance these needs?
Yeah, it's a great point, Brian. And this is where I think the SDGs are sometimes in conflict, that sometimes growing food and climate change are at odds with each other. And so I think to me, this is where design comes in. It's just finding ways to resolve those kinds of conflicts, which I think is what design does well. I think, the conversation in our session was as much about how can we look at agroforestry where we create markets for trees. Peter talked about, wood as a new building material for high-rise buildings. I mean, maybe there's a way in which the growing of trees becomes as profitable as the growing of soybeans.
I would like to add to that too. In our own project too, we had to do a lot of balancing, between do we just plant trees or do we plant economic trees? And because each time we make a proposal, we ask ourselves what's significance. What significant is this trees planting in this area? How will it be accepted? By the people? Will it add value? And if it will add value, what kind of value? Is it just aesthetic value? Is it economic value? So yes, that's quite a valid point. We need to trees for climate change. There really needs to be a balance, especially in developing countries. Should it be just trees or should it be trees for economic gains? So thank you very much for that. There is another one for Daniela, that although it is a challenge, should we always measure the impact of our projects at the next size up? That is, always examine if our local projects have regionally relevant impacts. Regional projects have national significance. Daniela, would you like to take that? Or
yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think it's a fascinating question. I think that some projects don't necessarily need to be measured at the next size up and can be measured in their local context. And I say that in the sense that if there's a regional plan or something set specifically, then you don't necessarily need to always scale up and down. But I think for the most part, the intention, the Sustainable Development Goals is global. And I think that this whole project is about trying to figure out how do these individual projects scale up to that bigger picture. And so I think we do want to keep in mind that smaller scale things scale up and that we want to keep that upscaling measurement and that upscaling mindset relevant and present as we're moving forward with designing sites.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll look at some of the questions that we raised ourselves, like a question by Tom, where I was talking about land ownership, land ownership, and how to get the people to release their farms for tree planting. Does anybody want to say something about that, or do I say something? Okay, from our own projects, that's quite very, very vital. But a lot of schemes, a lot of schemes where government groups the farmers into cooperatives. So you have small farmers coming together, even if it's for loan or for fertilizers, you come in as a cooperative, and then some group of people are responsible for, what you get as a group. So I think there are schemes like that where, the cooperatives advise farmers, on who to let a portion of his land for trees and stuff like that. So there's a lot of schemes in my country, you know, by the central bank, you know, where it involves farmers and different schemes that takes care of such things. So that's what I'll say for Nigeria. I don't know about other countries or other nations. Anything for Brazil or anything similar elsewhere? Will you like to look at that? Who will be looking at a similar place? Daniela, will it be something similar? Where you are? Hello? Hello? Anybody hearing me? Louis?
Maimuna,
Can
it
you
looks
hear me?
like Carl and Tiana have both their hands up.
Okay, I'm very unstable network because of the thunder here. So can I take Carl, please?
I had a comment, an observation on this year's projects right across the board that is
Okay.
a new one for me, but let me explain a little bit. Whenever you're organizing a study inside the scenarios of the IGC, there are two decisions you have to make that really we've never talked about and we've never asked people to report on, but I'm beginning to believe they're very important. And this is a subject where somebody's PhD or master's student could do some very interesting study across all of our studies. There are two decisions you make on the sequence by which you study a project. The first one is, do you start in 2020, make a design for 2035, and then make a design for 2050? Or do you start with a design for 2050 and work backwards to what you could do immediately for 2035, and then look at what's optional based on the existing conditions? That's a very important choice. And we had studies in this meeting which did it both ways, either one or the other of those ways. The second equivalent important decision: do you study the three scenarios in parallel, meaning at the same time, there's a team that goes from 2020 to 2035, then it branches between the late and the early 2050 people and the non-continues? Or do you first, in a small group, do the non-adapter, like the Brazilian teams, many of them did, then decide whether there's an innovation and decide whether it could be done early or it can be done in 2050? Or you start with the early adopter, which I intend to do in the next one I'm working on, and then say, well, what if we don't do it until late? And then what if we don't do it at all? And we now have enough studies that it's possible that we could find out does it make a difference to the end products, especially in a negotiation, whether you start in this sequence or in this sequence? Nobody's ever asked that question before. It's a really important decision when you're beginning to design a structure of a study. I know of no papers in the field that talk about the sequence in which the problem is set. I don't know of any papers on that subject, but we have the material to make that kind of a study.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carl. Sorry, whose hands was up?
You have Tiana's name is up. Hand is up.
Okay, Tiana's name is up. Yeah. Yeah, Tiana, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that when we were thinking about the Trillion Trees initiative, there was some kind of limits but because of the time also. First, we didn't know how to explain that a live tree is more valuable than the timber or no tree at all. So once we get this prices a bit higher to have a live tree, that is going to bring more value then we can think about planting trees. Another thing that I think that it was very important to know that planting trees is not sometimes can produce negative effects. Sometimes doesn't need to bring ecosystem capacity. So we need to look into that. I found the Rewilding Europe initiative a kind of a inspirative initiative, which really brings back wilderness into Europe. So I thought that perhaps, and they're also thinking that this can contribute to the local economic development because of the some kind of tourism, better food, more cleaner air, cleaner water, and so on. So our idea was really to bring transdisciplinary perspectives of the forest. Like let's put the complexity inside. There is difference between being simple and between being vulgar. If you have people who are cutting trees without thinking what the consequences of this will be, it can be simple, but it's vulgar also. So you need to explain the significance, the meanings of this. And really what I found interesting is that we as planners really in the state of the world that we live in, I think that our most ethical obligation is to provide alternatives. That we cannot go into, because everybody has their idea what is just, what is valuable, what is not. We should be there to offer, like, look, if you go that way, the consequences will be this. If you go the other way, that will be the consequences. So I think that really we need to build the knowledge about understanding the consequences and also bringing innovation that our food industry is changing also. We are going to be eating nuts very soon. We will not be eating meat. We will not, there is a possibility of having one parcel, very small, change the compost. You can build, you can have agroponics as well. So we should look into those innovations as well.
And on that fantastic note, thank you, Tiana. That was a really good closing for this morning's session. And thank you, Maimuna, for chairing the group. Much appreciated. I have the job of moving us to the long break that we'll have today. But one thing I wanted to do is I want to really encourage you to come back after the 4-hour break, because the next two sessions are really, really important. The presentation from the Nature Conservancy represents an international NGO that is making very, very large scale policy suggestions and directives associated with the kind of issues that interest us. And we are highly complementary to the work of the Nature Conservancy, because we are all about changing those ideas into spatial design. So this is a group to listen to, because we need to understand how we connect with them. And then the final session this evening, providing we can keep Carl awake, that's going to be a major challenge for us, is to talk about, where have we come from in the last 3 years since 2018, and this idea of IGC started, and where do we go next? We have got a tremendous transition team that has been elected, that we'll mention tonight and that we'll be meeting tomorrow to talk about the next steps of IGC. But this conversation this evening, this evening for me, late night for some, early morning for others, this conversation will be really, really important. So please take a break now. If you'd like to continue in the Wonder Room, the link for the Wonder Room is right on the website, on the program page. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you 4 hours from now for two really important parts of this meeting. Thanks a lot. Great sessions again today. Really enjoying this. Very good.